Hey, what's up guys, it's Oakley and I'm going to be doing an online multiplayer battle. I'm deciding to use Carthage and I'm going to be using Hannibal's tactics at Cannae. I actually fought an online opponent who was a viewer of the channel, very cool to see, and he actually hadn't seen, or I actually at this point hadn't uploaded the video showing that I was going to try using this Cannae tactic, so it kind of happened that my opponent chose Rome and he ended up facing Hannibal's strategy. Anyway, the strategy involves drawing the enemy into the center by drawing back your own troops and then holding fast with heavy troops on the sides and turning in on the troops that are drawn into the center. So we're going to see how my opponent reacts. Anyway, historically what would happen is Hannibal at this point had beaten several Roman armies sent against him in Italy, and he would have been very confident. His crack troops, his Libyans who were taking up the flanks, would have been outfitted with heavy Roman gear. They would have had lots of training, and the enthusiasm and morale of Hannibal's army would have been very, very high due to their unprecedented string of victories. The Romans facing them would have been tired of losing. They would have had some veterans, but many of them would have been discouraged by previous losses, and most of the troops would have actually been raw recruits or troops with very little skill and training. And the reason for this was the Romans decided that they would just throw everything at Hannibal and try and crack him, break him apart. And so what they fielded was 8 Roman legions combined with 8 legions of allied troops, making for about 85,000 against Hannibal's about 55,000. So the Romans significantly outnumbered Hannibal in the infantry department. However, Hannibal did have the advantage in the cavalry department. And so what happened is the Romans decided that with their infantry advantage, they would make up for the fact that they didn't have much skill and go for quantity instead of quality. And what they decided to do was form up and try and push through, grind through Hannibal's men, push straight through the center. That played into Hannibal's strategy, where Hannibal, in the deployment of the battle, made a solid front and then deepened the flanks. This wasn't visible to the Romans because obviously when you're down on the ground level, you can't really see what's going on, whereas here we can see above and can see sort of the arrangement of my troops. But in any case, the Romans were scared that Hannibal's superior cavalry would make the best of them, and so the field of battle was accepted by the Romans in a more constrained area. So if you were to imagine this is the battlefield, to the left would have been a river, to the right would have been hills. And so the Romans decided to fight on this constrained ground so that they could sort of push their meat grinder of the Roman legions straight through the center. And this kind of played into Hannibal's setup because he wanted the Romans to be pushed through the center. Hannibal also knew what was the makeup of the Roman consuls. As I said, this was a consular army, quadruple-sized consular army, and there are 2 consuls leading it. They would have been Paulus and Vero. So Paulus was more conservative, more inclined to be careful in his actions. This was something that was not necessarily popular amongst the Romans, who desperately wanted to be rid of Hannibal, but it was the more sensible approach, the best way not to get slaughtered by Hannibal and his tricks. However, another one of the consuls was Vero. He was very much sort of old school Roman, trying to get into the thick of the fight, and Hannibal knew this, and he knew that also consuls would change leadership of the army. So every other day the leadership of the army would change, and so on the particular day of the fight, Vero was leading and he led the Roman army into the trap. So anyways, that's enough for history. Let's go ahead and talk about this battle right here. My opponent has done something that the Romans were not willing or able to do. Here my opponent has formed up the Romans into a long, massive line, and he's the one who's actually going to be sweeping around me at this point. What I decide to do is send out my skirmishers, and I try and break through my opponent here. I'm trying to selectively weaken his troops and probe him with my cavalry. Now, my opponent is doing exactly what you should do, and he's moving around the flanks, and he's going to be facing what would be my Libyan, my cracked troops around the sides. So I'm going to be pouring in the fire right here, trying to destroy some of his troops. So you can see massive fire on some of his legionnaires, but because of their large shields, it's not going to break through. What I'm going to try and do right here is penetrate, break his line through the center, and I'm going to alternate the fire of my troops here on his sides and also on his gladiators who are weaker. I'm going to try and punch through right here, and what my intention was, because my opponent has been spread thin and I know he can't immediately crack my flanks because that's where my best troops are, I'm going to go ahead and break through his center where he's weaker. Now my opponent does a spectacular move with his cavalry. Take a look at that. On the left, he swings his cavalry right between both our lines. Very, very bold move, very Alexander of him, sort of what I would have thought Alexander did at Isis, where he led the charge and just went to the critical point of the battlefield. Very good move, and he seizes the opportunity and breaks my skirmishers right then and there. It's at this point that I'm going to form up and engage with his forces on the side of the battlefield, and then my troops in the center are going to start moving forward, reinforcing, pushing out here. On the right, I'm going to fall back and reform. Now, my general has been put into the combat, but I'm going to try and help him out. Over here, my crack troops, my pikemen, are going to be facing my opponent. I had a lapse of micro on the left. My cavalry got charged, but you'll see they hold out pretty long. Anyways, I'm going to charge in through here with my infantry. I'm going to fall back on the right, try and reform, hold off against my opponent. He's a bit drawn out, and he's not in any position to break through right here, so I'm feeling good. In the center, however, is going to be a problem, so that's why I'm going to be trying to reinforce that. As well as over here, I'm trying to make sure he doesn't outflank me, and then I'm sending more reinforcements to break the tide here. My general, however, is going to be starting to lose more and more men because my opponent is using his skirmishers in the back to just pick off my men. Very, very excellent use of slingers, baiting me in, and then you'll see how he uses them here behind the lines, and he's targeting the flanks of my forces, anyone who becomes engaged, and you'll see how effective this is later in the battle. Anyways, you can see right here we formed the wing here, sort of the initial stages of the fight that Carthage would have had with Rome, where it's an outward bowing. What Hannibal would have done is made his troops slowly fall back and then pull the Romans into the center. But at this point, my opponent has cleverly spread his Romans out, and they're facing me on all flanks. So at this point, we've gone out the door in terms of the history, and we're revising history. But anyways, my opponent is doing very well, reinforcing, sending his troops around, and you can see those slingers are definitely decimating my cavalry. Took out my general. That's a very key moment. Now in the battle itself, Hannibal and his generals would have taken very few casualties. The Romans actually had stationed their cavalry on either flanks, so to the north and to the south. One of them up by the river to the north was some cavalry. That would have been Paulus. To the south would have been Vero. Now, in the initial skirmishing engagement, it's thought that one of the slingers or some sort of missile hit Paulus to the north. He was forced to dismount and rest. His bodyguards did the same, and in the preceding moments, most of his cavalry got off their horses and tried to form a stationary blob of infantry to hold that flank and make sure that they could protect their general. But what happened is that coincided with the charge of the Carthaginians on that flank. They shattered the Romans there, and they were able to break through Romans on that flank, crush the cavalry. Now it's thought that Paulus was probably killed at this instant. However, he could have retreated, but at the end of the day, he was killed. So at some point, he was killed. Anyways, the Carthaginians break that. The cavalry stream through, break that flank, and they turn around, and they are going to be engaging not only the rear of the Romans in the center, but also Vero to the south, who was otherwise butted up against some hills, and he was holding off the Carthaginians. So in one fell swoop, Carthage breaks the Roman flanks, basically rolls up the sides, and now they crush the Roman infantry. Now, the Roman infantry otherwise had been making headway against Carthage, and they'd been pushing slowly but steadily into the middle. With this push, the troops got excited, and especially if you think about mob mentality, once they start making a push towards the center, they go to the area of least resistance. They're pushing through, and so troops in the middle start getting eager. They push against their fellows, and all sorts of cohesion that was part of the triplex axis starts falling apart, and you get a massive Roman blob. So all of a sudden, they're pushed too far into the Carthaginian trap, and at this instant, that's when they find themselves pushed too deep, and Hannibal orders his Libyan troops on the flanks to turn, face inwards, and then start crushing the Romans from the side. This brings the Roman forces to a halt. At that same instant, the cavalry return from Carthage, and after defeating the Roman cavalry on either side, they're going to come in and finish off the Romans in the back. And it's going to seal up the Romans and secure victory. However, what happened in this online battle is my opponent did not allow his Romans to get bottled up. He went around and outflanked me, and it led to a crumbling of my forces. Unfortunately, the end of this battle got a bit glitchy in the recording, but you can see how effective my opponent did, and how if the Romans had been able to spread out and use the terrain to their advantage, they might have been able to undo the disaster of Cannae. Anyways, awesome battle. I look forward to bringing more of the detail of Cannae in the future. This was just a quick look at it and maybe a revisionist view of history based off online battles. Anyways, thanks so much to my opponent. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I didn't get much time to commentate on the battle itself. You did great. Very, very awesome playstyle. I just wanted to bring more of a history aspect to it, and I hope to play with you guys more in the future. So, yep, see you guys next time.